All right, today is Wednesday, December
14th.
14th. I'm Ben Geisberg, and this is Debbie Gregg, and this is a Centennial Oral History. So, first off, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, sort of your connection to Coquitlam, your connection to Centennial,
Okay.
anything else that's relevant?
All right. My family was in Vancouver, and when I was about 4, my parents realized they probably couldn't afford to buy something in Vancouver even in those days, and were able to buy property and then build on a lot just off of Gatensbury in Harbour Chines, which was the subdivision at that time. And that's how we came to be out here. No connection prior to that. It was one of those decisions that was slightly serendipitous. They had also had property in North Vancouver, and we're going to build there, and ended up building and selling, and we moved to Coquitlam. So that's how I ended up.
I'm sure that's a pretty common story then and now that can't afford to live in Vancouver.
It's actually quite interesting because, of course, they grew up in Vancouver, my parents, and so it is kind of cyclical in a sense.
Yeah.
You know, people have had to have that happen.
So what year did you come out here?
We came out here in 1957.
Okay.
And at that time, there were lots of empty spaces still in Harbour Chines. It was not really super developed at that point. It became more so over the next couple of years.
Okay, okay. So what was it like growing up in Coquitlam?
In those days?
Yeah.
In the very early days, it was fun, actually. We still had lots of bush, and in that neighborhood there still is a fair amount of what we used to call the bush, which is the ravine below. So it was great. We ended up spending a lot of time in our yard. We had a big yard, but we also had a chance to go and play in the bush, as we called it, down at the end of our court, which had what we euphemistically called the bouncy tree. And we could spend hours on that. It was probably a fallen alder, but that was what we would spend hours doing. I had 2 younger brothers. I have 2 younger brothers. And so both my younger brother and I came out with my parents, and then my youngest brother was born in Coquitlam.
Oh, yeah. So you're quite close to the family growing up, and
yeah,
nice.
It was. I mean, there weren't kids around, but it wasn't like we had in those days. You weren't in kindergarten because there wasn't a kindergarten, so there was no daycare. There was no opportunities to meet younger kids at that time unless they lived on your crescent or court in those days.
What was sort of the social environment like in Coquitlam, just in terms of who was out here, what kind of people, and how did you make friends?
It was, it wasn't particularly multicultural. It was a community that was basically white, middle class, Anglo-Saxon for the most part, at least in our neighborhood. I had a couple of close friends, not always my own age, but on our court and across the street, that kind of thing. Most of it was actually playing out on the street is how you met kids. It wasn't until I went to elementary school at Parkland that I started meeting a few more kids from the area. And at that time, though, Coquitlam was growing fairly quickly, and Parkland, for me, was only a 2-year event, and then I changed schools when they built another one, which was slightly closer to us, but not a lot, and I was at Porter Elementary for 2 years, and then at Harborview Elementary for 3. So I ended up meeting a lot of kids along the way that I actually reconnected with when I went to junior high.
Why did you, switch schools so much? Was it just because
we never moved?
Built,
we did move, but the enrollment was growing so quickly in those days, and they just kept building new schools to accommodate more and more families coming out.
Okay, that's sort of what I figured. What are sort of 3 words or phrases you use to describe just your childhood, growing up out here, related to Coquitlam, and sort of,
3 words. I think it was a very nice childhood. I can't, it's probably not the best word to describe it. It was a nice childhood. There wasn't anything that was particularly dramatic or traumatic in any particular direction. I would say it was a close-knit childhood and growing up. And I think, the opportunities out here. I mean, I don't think people appreciated that as much maybe at that time, but we had lots of opportunities to do things that growing up in the city you would not have had, and then not dissimilar to today, actually.
Because Bill talked a lot about like sort of like the freedom that you had and things like that, and just sort of like the carefree nature of being a kid out here is I guess, and you share that too, right?
Yeah, I think, and it could be simply the nature of that time too. Right. But I think that because we were fortunate to have still a lot of wilderness/nature very close by, if not right in our backyards almost, it gave us lots of opportunities to be out and about, and it wasn't unusual for my dad to throw us all in the car and go. In those days, Burke Mountain wasn't developed at all, and remained so for a very long time, so it wasn't unusual for us to go up there and just hike around and not have to find a parking space and pay for a pass, and that was just fairly common that you would go and do those things.
Right. So sort of, I guess, like on like a larger scale. So I know you grew up on the hill.
I do. Yeah.
Did you have any connection to the mill, or was there a reputation you might have had, or anything like that?
I've been thinking about that a lot because Bill said that you had also talked about that with him. Because in those days, I lived on the other side of the hill. So Bill lived at the top of the hill, and I lived on the other side. So I was actually closer to Port Moody.
Okay.
And so, which also had Flavel Cedar. But yes, the connections would be somewhat tenuous, but there were a lot of guys in high school that had summer jobs and night jobs at the mill on the green chain, which was the worst shift to do. We knew people in high school, certainly, because there wasn't an easy way to get around Coquitlam, so you tended to be pretty neighborhood focused. So it wasn't until I got to Winslow as a junior high in those days, Como Lake, which was across the tennis courts, drew its kids from Millardville.
Right.
And I mean, I still feel guilty calling it Millardville because I know better than to say that now. But that's how we grew up, and most of our friends from high school's names were heavily anglicized at that point. They didn't use, for the most part, French pronunciations at all.
Right. So I guess the connection was a bit, I don't want to say tenuous, but because you knew people working there, but
and
it was
they were mostly guys. There weren't many girls, in quotes, that I knew from down there. It was an older neighborhood, right. And so it wasn't one that we tended to, and it wasn't easy to get there, unless you rode your bike or you had a car, which not a lot of people did. So.
Right. And then I guess sort of related to that, did you have any connection to Millardville or this area, or what was it sort of known as?
Well, I mean, the city hall was down here at one time, and my father did a lot of volunteer work and that sort of thing. So we would come down occasionally down around Brunette. To either wait for him while he went into City Hall, or in those days it wasn't called City Hall, it was the Municipal Hall. And I think, the access to New Westminster for many of us was often through Brunette and through Sapperton. Right. So that was why we would be down here. But no, we didn't have a lot of direct connection down here.
Well, did it have, I guess, like a reputation, or was there something it was sort of associated with? Because Millardville's gone through a lot of changes.
It's gone through a lot of change.
Yeah.
I don't have a particular recollection. I mean, people would like to say things like the wrong side of the tracks and that sort of thing, but I don't think I ever thought of that. It was just simply not in my geographical area. But I had some very good high school friends that lived in this vicinity, so to speak.
Okay.
So.
Oh yeah, you're talking about your dad volunteering.
Yes.
What kind of projects were there to do?
That actually has always been a big part of growing up in our family was community work in a sense. And my father, and us moving out here, from the time we moved out here, there were no municipal services to speak of out here, and particularly there was no library. And so in the early 60s, my dad, along with some other people, sought to get a library built in Coquitlam. I think little did he realize it would become probably a decade and a half project. But we grew up reading, and so going to New Westminster to the library was an event. So my father was very involved in actually the formation of the Coquitlam Library. And so was actually so awarded and recognized for that a number of years later. And so we grew up with the idea that you gave back to the community in however ways you did it. We weren't an overly athletic family, so he wasn't a coach at things. He was very good at it, but we didn't grow up in a lot of organized sports, unlike Bill, who played every sport. That wasn't the case. And being a girl growing up here, there weren't a lot of opportunities for girls to play in organized sports. So ice skating was pretty much the only kind of event, or swimming.
And even that you can only really do a little bit out of the year, right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly. So
that's really interesting with the library. Could you sort of speak more to that, or like anything you remember from that, any experiences?
I distinctly remember, because in those days you had to have plebiscites for pretty much anything to raise money. And I can remember in one of our bedroom closets for many years we had stacks and stacks of ballots that had been created, I'm sure on a hand crank machine, that we used for extra paper, because, and that I remember quite clearly, having all of that paper around that asked, will you support a Coquitlam Library? And it was just interesting that became that. The first sort of branch, I guess, of the library was really a co-production, so to speak, with Centennial. And that was the first time Coquitlam people had a chance to use a local library, which was the Centennial Library.
I guess sort of shifting to talk about Centennial. I guess what was Centennial like for you? What was your experience there?
Centennial was, I think I was actually quite excited about going to Centennial. I had been at Winslow, and we had been on shift for 2 of the 3 years because of, again, growing populations and various things. So when I got to Centennial, I actually felt like I had a school year that made more sense to me. And being on semesters where you could spend longer was nice. It was for me, having longer blocks of time rather than 42 minutes or whatever the block was in junior high. So I really wanted to go there. And had a chance, obviously, to do some things that I can continue to do, things I really had loved at junior high, but the chances and the opportunities were greater at Centennial. So,
do you think you really thrived and took advantage of that, like that unique environment, for the freedom that you had and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot, actually. Interesting comment about the freedom piece, because I don't think at the time we thought about having as much freedom as we did in that school. And in hindsight, we had a tremendous amount, maybe a little too much, in the sense that I don't know if all of us thrived with that particular lack of structure, so to speak, at times, but I enjoyed it. I was involved in a lot of things. I had to give up a not particularly great basketball career because I wasn't tall enough, but I continued in the band, which I loved being in. I loved that opportunity. I was also a cheerleader. But I liked the social aspect of that too. I was involved in student government, and later in my career this became more ironic, but I used to run the elections for student council. So I was a rep, but I ran the elections, which people thought was kind of funny because I loved doing that, and that carried on into my later life. So what was
your sort of, I guess, day like in Centennial, and also related to that, in terms of that, the structure. Were you sort of aware of how unique that was, and how sort of special an opportunity that might have been for you at the time?
Well, that actually is a very good point. I think we did understand how special the opportunities were that we were being given. I don't know if we've thought about it on a daily basis, but I know my mother was also a teacher in the school district, and I remember her saying, this is not like how other secondary schools our run. And of course, we knew that, having come from a junior high for 8, 9, and 10, grade 11 and 12 were different. So my day, because I was in the band, so that we could fit everything in, I was on what was described as the first block A shift. So I had band practice first thing in the morning. And I had a large instrument, and occasionally my dad would drop me off for band practice. But I had an arrangement with a friend of mine who lived down the street, whose father was an assistant superintendent in the school board office. And they had 2 cars, so I'd walk down to her house, which was a block or so away, and then we would drive that car to the board office, which was right behind Centennial, and then we would be in time for band practice. And then her dad would get a ride with her mom, and the car would already be in the parking lot. So that worked out quite well, but it was a very early morning. It was, and I've always been an early morning person. I don't know if that generated it, but that's what happened. The day, and I was finished by noon. So for, I guess, 5 out of the 6 years, or 4 out of 5 years in high school, I never went to school beyond noon. So it was hard when I went to university, because I was not used to a full day, so to speak.
Having all day, yeah.
It was very unusual. I had cheerleading late in the afternoon, but that wasn't classes. I was finished by noon.
And what instrument did you play?
I played French horn.
Oh, cool.
I played French horn, and also in the youth orchestra. So I also took French horn lessons in Vancouver. So my parents had a fairly large commitment of driving us around.
I was going to say, that sounds like a lot. Yeah.
It was. No buses.
And yeah, I think, so, growing up in the 60s and 70s, very, lots of interesting, societally, it was a very unique time in the world as a whole.
A lot was changing in the world.
A lot was changing, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. And going to this new pattern of school, very sort of progressive, approach to school. Did those 2 things sort of intersect at all? Or
yes, they did. And I think looking back at the Catalyst newspapers, which was actually an award-winning high school newspaper for a number of years, looking back at that when we were planning for the reunion, it became much clearer again, I think, to all of us who were doing this, is that we lived through a very challenging time. I mean, that was when the first man landed on the moon in '69. We were also experiencing a big sexual revolution. We were also experiencing a drug culture that was in its, I would like to say, infancy. I mean, things like hash and marijuana were around, not hard in those days would have been classified as hard drugs, but so those things women were working in a workforce that was different. I mean, it wasn't too long into high school that women teachers were allowed to wear pants. I mean, I remember my mother always having to wear a skirt or a dress. So that all of those changes started happening around the same time. So it was a fairly, and of course the Vietnam War, which we weren't directly impacted, but it became a focal point for, I think, freedom of speech and the ability to express ideas in ways that you probably wouldn't have been able to have done previously or in other high schools. I mean, we had quite an active student government that promoted dialogue. Right.
Because I think, and then either in or out of school, were there any events that affected you in particular? For example, what I think when I ask that question, my mom, she grew up rural Nebraska, a farm town,
right?
And she said, every night they would watch Walter Cronkite and report the Vietnam War, and that was huge because there they are in a farm town, Nebraska, and that's in the house all of a sudden, right? That sort of experience. Was there anything maybe in that vein for you?
I think that one of the things that struck me was my awareness of the ability to get involved in politics. I don't want to say I came from a particularly political family. I mean, I know they had particular leanings. I became, and I guess unabashedly, about at the age of 13, 14, whatever year that was, when Pierre Trudeau first ran. I remember quite distinctly I became a young liberal. I don't know if I'd want to promote that forever, but I had the buttons. I distributed those. I appeared at rallies in short dresses, but I was about 13 or 14 at the time, and I remember quite distinctly the excitement over having what I would probably classify as someone whom didn't fit the mold of a politician that we might have seen growing up, like a John Diefenbaker, or I think he was probably more in a mold of what we might remember up here as John F. Kennedy.
Right.
It was, and so that for me was the beginning of an awareness of the involvement people can have in a community. And I mean, I only had a few friends that got involved and did those things. I was kind of the anomaly, I guess.
Are there any like particular interesting stories or any anecdotes from Centennial or anything you remember?
From Centennial, anecdotes of Centennial.
Anything, especially especially related to
yeah,
that
I'm
we were
trying to
talking
think
about?
of things that would be. We had a running feud with the drama club because we had to share space, and we had to share the theater.
You in band.
In band,
Yeah.
we had a running feud with the drama people because we shared space. The theater was the only space that we could practice, and they obviously could practice. And so it was, we had skirmishes. We would hide their props, and they would do things to our music stands. And so, I mean, none of it was particularly awful, but, we did that. There was, I guess I'm going to admit to a lot of things now. I don't know if Bill told this story or not. It's probably slightly different than mine, but there was a running rivalry, a football rivalry between New West Secondary and Centennial, and it was a horrible sculpture of football boot, and the trick was to steal it back before the game, and a few of us went to New West Secondary, and was not a problem leaving Centennial because attendance wasn't taken, and it wasn't a big deal. At New West Secondary, however, most of us had not thought this through well. It was still a hall pass school. It was a school where you didn't see kids wandering around, and when we got there, we realized that we would stand out like sore thumbs, and so we kind of had to be a little more strategic on how we were going to steal this trophy. We did. I don't know why we were able to get at it. I guess in those days they didn't lock the cases, but that was one of the things that, we did as a running kind of thing. And we did the stuff that schools don't even think of doing. We did pep rallies, and we did, all of that kind of thing that one might associate with more of an American perspective. Not a lot of Canadian bands, for example, marched. We at Centennial as a band learned to march, not particularly well, but we did do the odd parade down in Bellingham, and we had to learn how to march and play and not trip over railway tracks and bump into each other and all of those kinds of things. And we'd go out in the field at Centennial and practice, which was rather embarrassing because people would come out and
point and laugh.
It was pretty
was
funny.
it like a stereotypical band geek jock dynamic?
You know what?
Do you think?
I don't like to think it was. I think some people might have characterized that because I mean, being a cheerleader, I also hung out with the football team, the basketball team. I had a boyfriend in high school who was on the wrestling team. So I knew all the coaches, they knew me, but I also was in the band. I also conducted the band. So I did lots of it. So I guess maybe I crossed over a lot of those. So there were people in the band that could have probably self-described themselves as geeks, and they didn't do a lot of things. But in fairness, a lot of them couldn't timetable other things into their schedules either. So that was one of the things that we did do at Centennial, and just thinking back in terms of, if you want to put in quotes, progressive, is that the automotive department, which was obviously all men, decided that girls needed some understanding of cars. And I had grown up in a family where my dad expected me to learn, being the oldest and the girl, how to do a lot of things. So the first course they ran was called car care. And I took that. And it was interesting. We had overalls, and for the first while, we were quite a novelty. The boys in particular would come and hang around and see what we could even do. But we learned a lot of the very basics around car mechanics, and we were able to, in those days, cars still had spark plugs and distributors and all those kinds of things. Learned to change tires. We learned to do tune-ups, and so it was actually quite interesting that the school would even decide to do that.
That's big for that.
It was big.
Yeah.
It was big.
I had another question on the tip of my tongue, but when I asked, when you were talking about the band stuff, it was just I guess I don't know, with sort of the freedom that you had at Centennial, you know, like what would, like, I guess this is a two-part question. What would you do with your, you know, spare time, or, you know, what was sort of your schedule like, or do you think it afforded you new opportunities? And then also, you know, when you went to, you know, because when you went to university, like, you know, how did that sort of, I guess, was it easier then to schedule, or, you know, to maintain that?
That's actually a very interesting question. Being in, well, the part about the band, it allowed, I think, a lot of us to have experiences we wouldn't have had. For example, we did do band trips, and we did them 2 years. And obviously, at Centennial, we had 2 big band trips. We were actually a very good band, and we were actually a very large band in those days. It's very unusual now to find school bands that are big, but we were a big band. One of our trips was down to Roseburg, Oregon, which was a very long bus trip, and played our way down there. And it was interesting to go to a small community similar to ours, but in our minds quite different. I mean, it was much more restricted. The kids were much more restricted in their movements and things. So we were a bit of an anomaly. Right. And then we went to Castlegar, which was a very, and still is a very small community. How did it maintained my interest in music so much that I did go to UBC for first year music. I was one of the few people from Coquitlam who went to UBC. Most of my friends went to UBC later on in life if they wanted to pursue other careers, but most went to SFU. I didn't, because in those days my only option for music was UBC. I got out there only to discover I was a fish out of water. There weren't many of us out there. It was extremely hard for me to meet people, because first year university, and any university is a challenge, but UBC even in those days was very big, and every part of your program was in a different building. So I spent a good chunk of my first year running between buildings.
I went to UBC. It's still the same.
And I taught out there in one faculty finally to know what it was like. But you know, and I had an instrument too, so it was even more challenging. So Centennial prepared me for a different life than the one I had at UBC. The one at UBC was highly rigid. It was not getting to know your instructor. It was, as you know, having been a graduate of UBC, it was the 50-minute hour. So you had 10 minutes to get between classes. And it was ridiculous. It was like I had been thrown back to junior high.
Wow. Was that different?
It was that different. I was used to having freedom. I was in lectures of 350 people, 400 people in English, 100. It was just beyond my scope of understanding of what I'd gotten myself into. Realizing that also music was not going to be a career for me. That was a big revelation.
That's a big revelation.
To come to. And I think when I realized that it was going to be a lot less of the playing, which I loved, and a lot more of the theory and the pieces that I didn't particularly love, I realized it wasn't going to be the place for me. So at the end of my 1 year there, I left and came back out.
So it's interesting, you know, talking about how much you felt like a fish out of water, because, you know, I you know, coming from the U.S., I felt like that, and then, you know, it's like, would you say that's sort of a divide, like just like the Coquitlam Vancouver divide? Because I mean, you certainly don't see that now, because, you know, there's tons of kids that commute in and all that.
It was. I mean, when I went to UBC, I did end up with groups of people that, And when I told them I lived in Coquitlam, although I didn't, I was living with my grandparents in Vancouver, so I could attend university, and I didn't have a car. It was much easier for me to do that. I would meet people from Richmond, and they go, "Oh my God, you live in Coquitlam? Like that must,
Like it's.
I mean,
like,
I had
it's
friends.
The boonies.
It's the boonies.
Yeah.
It was absolutely the boonies. It was, I met people who never left Vancouver, who didn't even know a world existed past Boundary Road. So it
still exists.
It still exists. No, it does. I actually have friends who don't go past Granville because they think nothing is beyond Granville. No, it was interesting because part of it was we didn't have transit out here, so we weren't able to easily access Vancouver. I ended up, all of us learned to drive. I don't know anybody who didn't learn to drive by the time they were 16 out here, because when you turn 16, you could get your driver's license and actually drive yourself to a friend's. That was just what you had to do, because you wouldn't survive if you didn't have a driver's license out here.
Bill's talking about the freedom that he was afforded, and all the things that people could do, and he described it as like a mini college campus going to Centennial, just in terms of the freedom and the kinds of people that are around. I guess, but then your experience is so different.
Well, it was in some. I wouldn't disagree with that analogy, except I think it was probably more typical of an experience somebody might have had at SFU as opposed to going to UBC. UBC was, and still is to a certain degree, a very old school structure. It's because of its size, it runs in a certain way. So allowing students to have the kind of freedom, if you will, that people were having at SFU just wasn't going to happen. People thought it was very strange that, the friends of I who went from Coquitlam to UBC just couldn't, for the most part, couldn't get over the structures. Right. And if they were in a specific faculty like commerce, it was a little bit easier because it was more structured and focused on building-centric courses, if you will. You were able to be in an education too. Unfortunately, I wasn't in a faculty like that, so I didn't have that experience. Engineering would have been another example.
So after your first year, you left UBC and you
left UBC. I went to Douglas College because I actually didn't know what I wanted to do, and so Douglas College was an option, and obviously very small classes, and it gave me a chance to figure out what next, because I had never really contemplated what I would do if I didn't go into music as a career.
So then after Douglas, did you go back to UBC or?
I went to SFU. I went to SFU, and that's where most of the people I knew had gone. And I decided that I needed to make money, and in those days you could get out of SFU with an education background fairly quickly to start teaching. And so that was never my goal, but I ended up doing that.
So I know I've sort of asked this question about 4 ways already, but how did some in terms of moving around and finding what you really wanted to do, that kind of thing, how did Centennial or how did that environment affect your outlook on that? And if it's, I know this might be a bit repetitive, so feel free to.
That's a very interesting question about the affect of an effect of the Centennial experience and going to SFU, because I think really this is something Bill and I had a conversation about not that long ago. As I said, fundamentally I think it affected me, but I didn't realize how much it affected me until I started my own teaching career, and that's when I realized that choice and self-reliance and self-respect and all of the things that we had been afforded were actually fundamental to the way I believed I should be teaching. Right. And so giving kids responsibility, but doing it at a very young age, became a focus for my teaching. And so it really did impact me in ways that I could never have anticipated.
Right.
Later on.
So now we're moving into that, into after university. So so I guess two questions. They're both probably big questions, but how did Centennial affect your outlook on teaching, and then also because you taught in Coquitlam?
I did teach in Coquitlam.
So how did growing up in Coquitlam sort of affect you?
There's a Coquitlam effect that even to this day people laugh about, because it was a very inbred school district, let's put it that way. So it wasn't uncommon for us to, the superintendent at the time, superintendent of schools at the time's daughter went to the high school. Assistant superintendent's daughters went to the high school. Both two of my best friends. So getting a job in Coquitlam, if you lived in Coquitlam, became a running joke, if you will. If you lived and you grew up here, then everybody knew you and you'd get a job.
Because it was just that small town at the time.
It was a very small town, and even to this day, it can sound like a bit like a small town.
Okay.
But ironically, my mother taught, but I came out of university when jobs became fewer. So most of my friends had jobs, and because I was behind them by a couple of years because of my choices I'd been making, I came in at a very difficult time and to get a job. And so I had to leave the school district to get a job in New Westminster in a special program there before I was able to then come back and get full-time employment in Coquitlam. And it took me a number of years to get onto what we would now describe as a full-time teaching position, just because it was a tough time for financial reasons in school districts.
And so I don't think you mentioned, but what did you teach, or what level?
Excuse me. I did both my teaching practicums in Coquitlam, one at Austin Elementary, which no longer exists, and one at Vanier Elementary, which is across from Centennial. And so my transition into teaching in Coquitlam was actually, my first full-time job was back at Vanier, which was kind of nice, which was a kindergarten job in those days. And it was full-time K, which meant I had what I euphemistically called the morning show and the afternoon show, and or the matinee and the evening performance, because you did the same thing twice a day. We didn't have full-time Ks in those days. I had 26 in the morning and I had 27 kids in the afternoon, which in hindsight,
that's a big class.
There's a lot of kids, a lot of report cards, a lot of 5-year-olds. I was fortunate. I had a purpose-built kindergarten room, which people think is kind of crazy, but I had a little courtyard outside my room where I could have them go out and just be outside, because they didn't get recess. And I had an in-classroom bathroom, which was a big deal. And so it was actually a lovely experience. But because I was on what was called in those days a temporary contract, the job was only mine for as long as my contract ran. And at the end of that year, because I was a low person on the totem pole, we didn't have seniority, but I wasn't picked up again for that school, and so I went to Moody Elementary. And I was there for 3 years, and still on a temporary contract. So every year I didn't know if I'd be reemployed. I taught primary there and did music. And I became, and ran for and became president of the Coquitlam Teachers Association. And that's how I got a full-time contract.
Finally.
Finally. I joke about that I had to become president of that time the association. It wasn't a union in those days. But I was probably almost the youngest president they'd ever had, and I was the first female full-time president.
Cool.
And I was around people whom had taught me, and people whom had been the dads of my friends, one of whom was still the superintendent of the school district.
That must have been a bit surreal.
It was a little surreal, because I didn't take myself particularly seriously. I was probably far too young to have had a job with that level of responsibility. It was a full-time job. I had office staff, and I was mid-20s.
Wow.
And one of my secretaries was my high school boyfriend's mother. And that's how small the community was in those days. Yes, so having to learn to call her by her first name and deal with
manage her
and manage her.
Yeah.
She wasn't. She was a lovely person, and so we worked. But she and I had to struggle a bit with that, because we had obviously were not together. Her son and I weren't together anymore, so it was a bit of a challenge. But it was a challenging time, because we had over close to, I guess we were about 2,000 teachers and principals in those days. And having a female president, I think was a challenge for people to get their heads around, especially when a lot of them had taught me. But I didn't think it was odd because I had grown, and actually my Centennial experience prepared me for that, because girls did all kinds of things at Centennial that didn't seem out of character.
Yeah, so that level of maturity and sort of that I guess confidence, right? Like, do you think that's how Centennial affected your approach to teaching and sort of?
I think all of those things came together. People laugh, but I'm by nature quite more of an introvert but give me a microphone and a room full of a couple of thousand people and I'm happy. Yeah. And so running elections at Centennial, getting up to a microphone was never a problem for me. And that continued all through my professional career.
Was there anything that you like directly brought into the classroom from Centennial, like any like ideas for, just in terms of how you were bringing up these 5-year-olds?
I think part of my belief of having kids develop a sense of responsibility and be held accountable for that responsibility. So it's a fine, it's kind of a fine balance between the two. People would look at me sometimes and say, "Oh, you can't expect 5-year-olds to do that." And I said, "Yeah, with support, they can do that."
Right.
And so I think my career with younger children, and then when I taught at UBC for many years, I still believed if I built in support for people becoming responsible, and was what I picked up from Centennial.
And sorry, what did you teach at UBC?
UBC, I went out there in the mid-90s to start a program because Coquitlam was shifting to the middle schools focus, and because I had a background in developmental childhood, that I was asked to go out, not because I had a middle school background, but because I understood kids' developmental stages. And so I went out to start a program at the Faculty of Education around middle schools and getting student teachers in a mindset. And we actually, it was a joint project between the Coquitlam School District and UBC to prepare teachers to teach, at that time, what many believed was a very unique period in kids' lives, that early adolescence piece. And that's what I went out to do, and I was only supposed to be there for a year, and then it turned into 2 years, and then it turned into 3, and I spent almost 16 years at University of British Columbia before I came back to Coquitlam for the school board office.
School board, yeah. Wow, that's interesting. And yeah, like, what are some changes that you saw, or I guess either that you observed or maybe oversaw yourself in the education system? Or, I mean, like in Coquitlam.
In Coquitlam, yeah. No, one of the things that I guess for me, change was a part of my life, and I think probably from the get-go, I tend to roll with change, and I tend to make the best of what I can with change. And so I think that again comes from my going to school history here, plus Centennial, with giving you the idea that you could do things and change wasn't a bad thing, and we lived in an atmosphere of that in that school. I ended up teaching in very unusual circumstances. One of my jobs was at Hillcrest. At that time was an elementary school, and it was a French immersion school, and which meant you had a dual track school, English and French. However, due to a lot of circumstances, the English population had dwindled to a fairly small number, to the point where you could no longer have a grade 1 classroom or a grade 2 classroom, or what would have been called a split classroom. They couldn't make the numbers work. There weren't enough kids. There weren't enough people wanting an English program. And so I went there as a department head, which we didn't have vice principals in those days. I went there as the department head, and I had a grade 1, 2, 3. Which kind of harkened back to the days of one-room schools. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm not sure how I'm going to make this work. But it worked, and it worked amazingly well. I was there for 3 years, and I kept my kids. for 3 years.
Wow.
And eventually some would move to grade 4, but I kept them for that period of time. And that's when I really understood what it meant to give kids responsibility for their own learning, their own behavior. And I carried that forward after that. I was asked to go to Kilmer Elementary, which is in Port Coquitlam. Again, it was a dual-track school, but with a very robust English-French population, and I was asked to start a K-1, which were not that well known in those days. And I said, sure, I can probably do that. And so I did that, and then I did the same thing there. I kept the Ks and the 1s, and then I kept the Ks, the 1s, and the 2s. And it was probably the best teaching experience I'd ever had, and then I carried that forward to UBC. So when I left the middle school program out there, I became involved with a number of projects in Vancouver, where most of my students were based, with what I would describe as some of the most interesting educators I'd ever met, who wanted to have kids in what were called family groupings, or whatever you might call them. And they were amazing experiences, and I don't think that if I had gone through my experiences at Centennial, where age and name and all those things weren't a big deal. Like, we were even allowed to call teachers by their first names.
Right.
Those things don't define a good classroom setting. If people call me by my first name, that doesn't mean they respect me less. It's how I deal with them. Right. And I think that that was really quite a fundamental piece of what I took away from Centennial.
As an educator, that's amazing. I think that this question was sort of answered itself by, growing up in Coquitlam, attending school here has had a positive effect on your career. I think it
absolutely. No, I mean, I'm grounded in Coquitlam. I don't live here anymore. That's by choice. But I truly believe that I was gifted an opportunity and had quite an amazing career because of what I was able to do in Coquitlam and be a part of. And to come back at the very end of my career was also a decision I made quite happily. I came back in a very different position than I'd ever left, and it meant a lot to be able to come full circle with my career.
I mean, and you came up with a different position, different mindset.
A different mindset and different, it's always been something different. It's always been.
What's the biggest change that you've seen in Coquitlam since growing up here? I mean, I don't, it's because, you're an educator for 40 years, I don't know if it's related to that, but just, it doesn't have to be specifically related to that, is what I'm saying.
I think I mentioned earlier that, the change in Coquitlam, I mean, certainly it's a much more well-developed place now. I mean, clearly it's a city, which it wasn't when I came out here. It has an infrastructure that obviously gives it a character. I think that the change for me is the lifestyle is very different in many ways, yet in some ways it's not. For example, I grew up very close to Como Lake, and that was a place to go and to hang out. And it still is. It's still a place for people to go and enjoy. Obviously, development out here is huge. Even not being out here for several years when I was at UBC, I wasn't out here that often. That was the one thing, was the development piece. It's the school district has been the third largest school district in the province for as long as I can remember, and it's held that because it still grows. It still has room to grow. The system itself is changed because of the nature of the population. Much more multicultural, things that we never contemplated, even when I started teaching. We now consider. Those are just the way life has changed all around us. So it's the biggest change, I think, though, is the density. The feeling that you're a little more closed in here than you were when I grew up out here.
Right. Yeah, I think that's sort of a common between Bill and Peggy were saying. It's just like looking around and you look and it's just like you could not imagine that being there. Back when you were growing up. Yeah, I think I don't know. I think that's just about it. I guess Oh yeah, sort of. This also relates to, but at any point in your career, in your life, and I think you sort of answered this as well. But is there anything that you think is unique to Coquitlam, that you wouldn't have seen anywhere else, and that can be related to growing up, to your career, to whatever it may be?
Unique to Coquitlam, I think, is what I said earlier in a sense, is that I don't think I've ever talked to people whom have said that this is still a very small town, and it's almost counterintuitive, but even people growing up here still know other people who know other people. And Peggy is a classic example. I mean, it's 10 degrees of separation with Peggy. She knows where everybody is and does it. And so I think growing up out here and thinking of it as a small town and still thinking of it that way is something that is unique.
Does retain that over for so long.
Which is very hard to believe given the growth in population and the movement of people. But you'll always run into somebody who knows somebody down the street from, it just, and you don't do that in other places. I mean, I know that people who grew up in Surrey don't have that same connection.
Right. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Is there anything specific that you want us to mention or maybe not to mention in the oral history? Or is there anything that you have to add that we haven't covered? Anything else that you think might be interesting, just relating to Centennial, to Coquitlam, to anything we've talked about?
I don't think so. I mean, with this past reunion that we organized, I think that the commonality of experiences we had growing up were pretty striking. But no, I don't think there's anything else in particular that I can say that is something that is going to help connect the dots any more than.
Actually, that is a question I probably should have asked. What was a reunion like?
Oh, the reunion.
Yeah.
Reunion. It was very interesting because I think we started out, well, first off, we didn't do it in the technical 50th year because of COVID, but it was an experience going back and looking at things that I hadn't looked at in a long time. Thanks to Jasmine and others here, we were able to piece together things that we hadn't. I think the disappointment for me, obviously, we didn't have a huge turnout. We had a good turnout. But was the loss of so many what I will describe as artifacts from the original building. And I had already retired from the school district when that school came down, and I think if I had still been in the school district at the time, I would have made more of an attempt to try to pull together things. I do have a part of my degree is in history, so I have a great love of artifact and story attached to that, so I would have been more than happy to go in and do that. So that was a big disappointment. I know it was for many people that there weren't things that had been saved. And, for whatever reason, no one took it upon themselves to do that. So we had, one of the largest, if not still one of the largest graduating classes ever in the province of British Columbia because we were a 2-year school. And it's hard to believe we had that many people graduating and hard to believe that we had about 10% of that show up for the reunion. So, and people who all things considered, it was actually a pretty decent turnout. So, but I think that once people got into looking at the few things we were able to put together, there was sadness that there wasn't more saved, and we did our best to try to pull together what we could, but that's a disappointment.
Did you have any expectations going into it?
No, I had none. I try not to set a bar too high for things like that, in part because we did struggle to get people to become interested, so we set the bar relatively low, I think, in terms of what was going to happen. So no, I don't think there weren't any no, I think we delivered on what we wanted to deliver on, and people enjoyed themselves and they had a chance to reconnect. As a result, there's a few of us, Peggy and Bill being two of them, who now get together with two other people from high school, and we've kept it to just a group of 5 of us, and we meet for lunch or coffee now every couple of months. And 2 of the people whom were at the reunion, one of them, his wife is a year behind us, they moved into Vancouver after living out here for forever, and they don't live far from me, so we meet for coffee just incidentally now too. So that's been a reconnection for me that is outside of what I would have probably have had happen if we hadn't had the reunion. So
I think now that's probably just about, unless there's anything else that you have to add about, because I think that's a nice note to end on, unless there's anything else you have to add.
No, I don't. No, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Okay. It's been good.
Well, thank you.